They say that this is the book to read to help lead conversations about sex. It reframes the dialogue and helps prepare young people for sexual relationships. Read it, share it, empower the young folks in your life. That was the take of NPR's All Things Considered on the topic of today's episode, and we are just as enthused to be in conversation with its authors. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the MCSR National Healthy Masculinity Community Conversation Series. My name is Adam Middleton. I'm the Digital Director at MCSR moderating today's conversation. And what's coming up is our discussion of Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, published by W.W. Norton, described by a review in Science magazine as profoundly eye-opening, and selected, as you just heard, as one of NPR's best books of 2020. We're so pleased to be joined today by its authors, Dr. Jennifer Hirsch, a professor of Sociomedical Sciences at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health, and Shamus, a professor of American Studies and Sociology at Princeton University. I'd also like to acknowledge that the research presented in Sexual Citizens was realized as a part of Columbia's Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, or SHIFT, which is co-directed by Jennifer and clinical psychologist Claude Ann Mellons. For more information about the book following today's discussion, you can visit sexualcitizens.com and by following along on Twitter with the hashtag #SexualCitizens. Before we begin, it's important to note that our discussion of Sexual Citizens will contain descriptions of sexual assault as students experience them. This material can be hard to listen to, and we know that in every room, virtual or not, there are survivors. Please take care of yourselves and know that you are not alone. If you or someone you care about needs help in the DC area, You Ask DC and Ask DC can help you find it. With that, we'll jump into today's conversation. Shamus and Jennifer, welcome. Your book, Sexual Citizens, looks to transform how we address and understand sexual assault. Through intimate portraits of life and sex among today's college students, you present an entirely new way to understand sexual assault with insights transcending current debates about consent, predators in a quote-unquote hunting ground, or the dangers of hooking up. The book reveals that the social ecosystem that makes sexual assault a predictable element of life on a college campus. Powerful concepts that provide a new language for understanding the forces that shape sexual assault, that shape young people's sexual relationships, and in turn aims to transform our understanding of sexual assault and provide a new roadmap for how to address it. So Jennifer, I'd like to start with you. Welcome again. Can you tell us about Columbia's Sexual Health Initiative Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, that study or SHIFT, and why you decided to write Sexual Citizens?
Sure. So Shamus and I are delighted to be with you. Thank you for that incredible introduction. We'd like you to come with us on every web that we do. I'll open with a story because the book, as you mentioned, is very story driven. So Austin was one of the more, all the students were interesting to interview, but Austin really sort of captured our hearts. He appears in the only really spicy sex scene in the book. He and his girlfriend together on a hot summer night. They made their own fireworks. I'll leave it there. But he was doing his part to narrow what researchers call the orgasm gap, which is the difference between men's and women's experiences of sexual pleasure on campus. And he was committed even beyond sexual intimacy to being a good boyfriend. And so there was a moment in the interview that shook him and was part of this reframing of campus sexual assault. We asked all the students in the interviews about their best and worst experiences of sex before we even got to conversations about consent. And he said, yeah, I had something happen that was kind of weird. And then he proceeded to tell us a story about right when he came onto campus in his first year, his roommate asked him to go sleep in another room because his roommate wanted to be alone with a girl. And so Austin went off to this girl's room where her roommate was in bed. And the roommate sort of lifted up her head when he walked into the room and said that she was really drunk and didn't want to do anything. And that's weird, right? When a stranger walks into your room and the first thing that you have to do is establish a sexual boundary. And he didn't respect it. He got in bed with her and he started to touch her body. And then he thought to himself, nah, this isn't the thing. And he stopped it. And so he recounted that story to us. And then as he was telling the story, he paused and his eyes welled up with tears. And he said, if you'll excuse me, fuck me. Because he couldn't believe, like he understood with the man that he had grown into being, he understood that what he had done was wrong, that it was assault. He could define assault, but he didn't think about himself as an assaulter. And so the way that campus sexual assault is framed frequently in conversation as bad people intentionally harming others leaves out a lot of the complexity of what happens, and it leaves it at the level of just people's choices. In Sexual Citizens, what we do is we describe, as you indicated, the whole social ecosystem, the social production of campus sexual violence, which we show readers how sexual violence is literally built into the environment, which might seem kind of depressing to think about it as built in, as a predictable feature of daily life, except that once you see how it's built in, you can think about what it might be like, what might be required to build different kinds of campuses, different kinds of environments. So we take a public health perspective, which is instead of looking at changing individual behavior, telling people to be better people, we think about what is required of all of us to build environments and communities in which sexual violence is less likely to happen.
Well, with that level of content, it sounds like this book could be for college students, for educators, administrators, those who are eventually matriculating into college. Was there anyone specific? Who did you want to reach in writing this work?
Well, Jennifer and I are ambitious, and we wanted to reach literally everyone. I mean, we kind of wanted to sort of change the national conversation about sexual assault on college campuses and really even beyond. So, a lot of the ways that we think about sexual assault that's happening on college campuses is that it's a college problem, right? That there's something wrong with college and that we could fix it by fixing what's wrong with colleges. And what Jennifer and I argue in the book is that sexual assault isn't a college problem, it's an everyone problem, which is why we want everyone to be part of the solution. We talked to a wide range of people in doing this research. We interviewed over 150 students about their lives, their sexual experiences, their experiences transitioning to college. We had a group of people who were integrated into campus life. So these were people who are younger than me and Jennifer, but who were researchers, always public about what they were doing, hanging out in dormitories, in religious student spaces, hanging out, basically playing Catan at night with students in their dorm rooms, on intramural sports teams, to give us sort of a rich sense of what college is like, and then why sexual assault is sort of, as Jennifer said, a predictable consequence of college life. And over the course of that research, we heard so many stories from students that sort of pointed to roots of sexual violence that were much earlier than college, that came because of experiences that they had sometimes like over a decade earlier or longer. So we talked to one young man who told us a story about being assaulted. And he was actually kind of unique in the people that we spoke to, and that he identified as being asexual. We tried to capture the broadest range of people's sexual and gender identities in the research that we did, but there weren't a lot of asexual identifying students on campus. And he told us about an encounter he'd had where a woman had sexually assaulted him. In his experience, that they had been drinking and he wasn't at all comfortable with what had happened. And he found this really unsettling for a wide range of reasons. One, as a man, it was difficult for him to sort of conceptualize and name the experience that he had had as an assault. But, in his processing of it, he went and he spoke to his parents about it. And to compound the kind of difficulty that he had with this experience was the response of his father, who pretty much blew him off and was like, that's not a thing. Like, women can't assault men. And sort of, in some ways, questioned both his sexuality, his identity, and his experiences. And, I point to this story to talk about, the deep role that this young man's parents had in shaping him as a sexual being, and how college couldn't just solve some of the challenges of his not really having sufficient sexual education, things that should have come beforehand, or not having supportive community environments that would affirm the ways in which he feels. And so, as we wrote Sexual Citizens, we wanted this young man's father to read the book, not because we call him out. We're not really part of a call out culture in this book. We're much more positive in how we describe things, or as positive as you can be in writing a book about sexual violence. But we wanted the communities that raised these young people that came to us at Columbia University, where we did the research, to sort of engage with the ideas and think, how are we preparing young people for their transitions to adulthood? How are we preparing them? This means religious organizations, schools, families, sports organizations. All of us have a role to play. Another way of thinking about this is that sexual assault is something that's not simple. It's actually really complex. And that means partially that there's going to be no simple solution. This is an everyone problem, and we kind of need all hands on deck in order to solve it. And so the book is written to sort of communicate to all of those people as a call to arms, not to say you're doing a terrible job and you need to be better, but instead to provide a hopeful vision of how we could all build communities, not just colleges, but communities most broadly, where people of all ages can thrive and come into their sort of sexual self-identity and live their lives in the ways that they wish.
And to help explain all of this, the book is centered around three big ideas: sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and sexual geographies. These are the lens through which you make sense of sexual assault. Can you share with us how these three ideas interact with each other?
Sure. So I will briefly define the ideas and then tell a story that illustrates them, and then unpack them a little bit more. So sexual citizenship as an idea is a little bit of a provocation. It's the idea that people have the right to choose their own sexual experiences, which is not the way that young people have typically been regarded in the United States, right? The sexual citizenship is frequently erased. And the other part of sexual citizenship is understanding that other people have those same rights. So other people are not objects for you to realize your sexual goals. Sexual projects are those goals. It asks the question, which you might think only two academics could ask, about what is sex for? It turns out that sex is not for only one thing. We discovered a wide range of sexual projects that students had, ranging from figuring out who they were, to gaining status, to accruing experience, or just getting rid of inexperience, to expressing care for another person. That was pretty rare. And also, occasionally to experiencing pleasure and giving pleasure to the other person. And sexual geographies, rather, calls attention to how space shapes sexual experiences and provides opportunities where sexual violence is likely to occur. So charisma was Black and described campus as a white space. And what she meant by that, as she described, was that there were a lot of spaces controlled by rich white guys who, in her words, couldn't dance, played shitty music, and didn't find her attractive. And she didn't really find them attractive either. But what that meant is that she primarily had to look for partners elsewhere. And so one night, she went out to Brooklyn to meet up with a guy she'd been talking with, a friend of a friend of a friend. And the subway was slow and it was raining, and it was one of those nights where Brooklyn is not that far, but it took her a really long time to get there. And by the time she got there, she was just soaking wet and peeled off her wet socks and just glad to finally have arrived. And so she sat down. They smoked a joint. They had a little bit to drink. They watched TV. Like, she was having a fine time, a good time hanging out with him, until all of a sudden, he put his hand like on her body in a way that she didn't want. And she was pretty clear. She was like, no. And she moved his hand. She didn't say no, she moved his hand. But then he just put it back. And she described over the course of that night, having sex several times that she did not want to be having. And so we can unpack Charisma's experience using those three concepts. So sexual citizenship, the guy that she was assaulted by totally did not recognize her sexual citizenship. He was not thinking about what she wanted to do by just proceeding ahead without acknowledging, without paying attention to the signals that she was giving. At one point, she indicated to him that she didn't want to be having sex, and he took that to mean she just didn't like that position, and he moved her. So he was really, really not paying attention to her sexual citizenship. Sexual projects, again, he seemed very clear about what his sexual project was. It was to have sex. She had not grown up in a context where she had a lot of room to think about her sexual project. And so her confusion about, or her lack of clarity about her sexual project, left her in a place of vulnerability to his overpowering her. And then finally, sexual geographies. She was away from campus on a rainy night, in a space controlled by another person. And she wasn't a rich student. Like, for some students, they could have just opened up their phones and called an Uber and gone back to campus. But that's a $60 or $70 ride. And that wasn't her life. And so she was, for all intents and purposes, trapped there. And so, sure, what he did was a terrible thing. Let's just be clear about that. Like, we are not apologists for assault, but there's a broader context, and people need to understand that other people have the right to sexual self-determination, but we also need to think about, why is it that we build campuses that students of color experience as white campuses, as white spaces? So you can see that all of these ideas are in play in understanding how sexual assault is not only the product of people making bad choices, but there's a broader context.
I appreciate that story, because as we got through the book, one of the things that really stuck out to us was that we were struck by the concept of those sexual geographies, specifically how much the spaces we create, the spaces that young people do or don't have, how that directly impacts a sexual encounter. I want to ask you to build on the idea of sexual geography, even though that story was so illustrative, specifically because why is it that spaces matter so much? Specifically, how do you think they create critical opportunities for prevention as well?
When Jennifer and I sort of talk about space, we start with some really simple examples. So imagine two young people hanging out at a campus event, and it gets late, sort of 12, 1 in the morning, and they want to continue hanging out. And they go to one of their rooms, and they open the door to that room, and what do they see? 4 pieces of furniture: a desk, a chair, a bureau, and a bed. Well, where are they going to sit? They're going to sit on the bed, but beds have meaning. Like, sitting on a bed with somebody at 1 in the morning, it's sort of laden with all of this meaning. And that doesn't make assault happen, but it changes what we describe as the sexual opportunity structure, like what's happening and how people experience that moment. We had women who told us stories about how they would perform oral sex on men just to leave the room. And those weren't stories of assault, but they were really stories of significant gendered power differences, where it was just easier to, in the words of these women, give the guy a blowjob to get out of there than it was to do anything else. And so this got us really thinking about space. And in Sexual Citizens, we build off classic feminist accounts of gender-based violence, or what feminist accounts call gender-based violence. And we note how those arguments are really grounded in a logic of power. that gender-based violence is an understanding of violence is about the power differentials between, in a kind of binary sense, women and men. But we're informed by so much other work that thinks about intersecting power inequalities like how gender is not the only basis of power inequity on campus, and that those power inequalities intersect with one another. Now, one of the places we really see power is space. So, Adam, I don't know what your office looks like, but my guess is it's a decent office, but it might not be as nice of an office as the CEO, right, or the president. And Jennifer and I, in our own university contexts, we've literally seen colleagues cry because they thought their office didn't represent their perceived status. Like, I'm really important, I should have a really nice office. And this helps us think about like space as being integral to power. Now, what Jennifer and I are trying to think through with Sexual Citizens and in just the broader project that we're a part of is, what are the levers that we could pull that we're not pulling right now? Things that we could really sort of move the needle in creative ways. And space is one of those things. And so as a part of what we've been doing, we actually created a free resource for any community to use. So there's no buy-in financially, there's a buy-in in terms of work you would have to do, called the Space Toolkit, which is sexual assault prevention and campus equity. And it's a way for institutions and communities to think about how space is being distributed on their campus or in their organization, and what some of the implications of that might be. So let me just give a couple examples of this.
Sure.
In most residential colleges, the way that the distribution of rooms works is that more senior students get better housing. So like when you're a junior and you're a senior in college, you get a better housing number. Now, that seems to make sense, right? Because we should honor people's status. But when we start to think about it from the lens of power and inequality, what we begin to see is how those policies augment existing inequalities. They actually make inequality on campus greater, not smaller, because they give more powerful people even more power in terms of the spaces that they control. Or if we think about sorority and fraternity life on campuses, one of the things about sorority and fraternity life is that by national rule, fraternities can serve alcohol and sororities can't. So what happens at events is that all of the events happen in male-controlled spaces. That gives men control over the places where socialization is happening. Jennifer and I aren't part of the conversation of like, we should ban fraternities or we need to like, put in all kinds of new policing into dorm facilities. We're thinking like really simply here, but in ways that could be really powerful. What would it mean to reevaluate our housing policy so that some of the least powerful students on campus got the best housing numbers? People who were freshmen or part of minoritized communities. What would it mean for the sort of national Hellenic councils to reevaluate their gendered policy in terms of who can control socialization space where parties happen? And these are things that we can do that don't require sort of radically rebuilding our campus or spending millions of dollars, but to take a kind of critical eye and ask ourselves, how is it that the distribution of space in our communities augments power inequalities? In the story that Jennifer told about charisma, she was talking about like not being able to go to parties and socialize on campus because white men controlled the spaces and she didn't like their music and she didn't like the amount that they drank. The solution to that isn't to like take away all the spaces from white people, but the solution would be like, what would it look like to create a campus context where the distribution of space centered people like charisma and they had opportunities to control those spaces as well? And so once you begin to think with this lens about space and power, and sort of critically evaluate, like, how is it that we could transform these things, you begin to engage in the kind of imagination that Jennifer and I are engaging in, which is thinking about re-understanding sexual violence as about intersecting forms of power inequalities, and asking, what are our policies, procedures, and internal organizational dynamics that are helping produce those power inequalities, and how could we design ways to produce them out?
I did want to stay with power inequalities, because you all in the book talk about the role of power in sexual assault. You spoke a bit about it from a gender lens, but would you be able to speak about what you were able to reveal about the way that race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other social identities, how they can influence the likelihood of sexual assault?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't intentionally frame it as an intersectional approach to power in the book, because the book is written for a broad reading public, but essentially that is what we do. It's a gender and beyond approach to power. If you think about the experience, the Charisma's experience of being assaulted, or the assault that Austin committed, there are, it was men assaulting women, but there were other dynamics at play. So, every single of the 150 plus students with whom we spoke, every single Black woman with whom we spoke described experiencing unwanted, non-consensual sexual touching. I just want to pause and repeat that. Every single one. And so if you only interpret that, if you only label that gender-based violence, you're missing the way that unwanted, non-consensual sexual touching is a manifestation of anti-Black racism. And so that it's important. It's not just important as like a conceptual thing. It's important because if you only think about it as sexual assault, then your only focus is going to be classic approaches to sexual assault prevention. If you label it also an instance of anti-Black racism, then that demands that your approach to sexual assault prevention include addressing racism. So that is one dimension of complication. Another story might be the story of Adam, who came from a pretty conservative, religiously involved Midwestern family. He wasn't out to his parents. It was his imagination that coming to New York, he would be like a kid in a candy store. He was like, oh, it's the gay paradise. I'm going to get on Grindr and live my best life. And in fact, like, it didn't feel like his best life. He didn't really want to be just like meeting guys and hooking up with them, and then they would ghost him. And he actually wanted to be in a relationship. And so he was really, really happy to finally have a boyfriend, as he described to us. The only catch was that, as he described it, his boyfriend was, in his words, kind of forceful about sex sometimes. And he also shared the story of one evening where his boyfriend came home drunk and, in Adam's words, basically raped him. Students were very hesitant to label sexual interactions as assault, particularly when it was someone they cared about. Adam didn't want to, bring his boyfriend up on charges and get him expelled. He didn't want all of his friends to have to choose sides. He didn't want to lose the relationship that was the kind of relationship that he wanted to be having. And so an approach to sexual assault that is only about gender doesn't give you any tools for understanding what produced that vulnerability. And it also focuses you really only maybe on the campus context, where what we need to think about is the community that Adam grew up in, right? If he had grown up in a family that he felt comfortable coming out to, or if he had gone to a school that had a gay-straight alliance, or that had LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, he might have felt like he deserved to be in a relationship that was free from sexual violence. So there's a broader context where all of these different intersecting inequalities produce vulnerabilities. You can't understand the reasons, the many, many reasons that LGBTQ plus students experience the highest rates of sexual assault if the only thing that you're thinking about is gender. So sexual assault is many things, as we describe in Sexual Citizens. And so we need to think about many different forms of power that are at play, sometimes simultaneously, in producing those assaults.
This was a years-long effort. It's been almost 3 years since the book came out, it's finding new audiences. tell us, did you experience any challenges or surprises or difficulties while conducting your research with students? I mean, what surprised you in doing this research?
How much time do you have, Adam? No, I mean, as a researcher in general, there should be things that you expect to find and you find them. Not everything should be a surprise. And then there should be some things that are kind of curious, interesting. And I think some of the stuff that's is a surprise to us upon further reflection maybe isn't as much of a surprise. But, we were surprised the degree to which people described assault as having sex. And this happened in two ways. There was a young woman who described, in the charisma story, she was describing it as having sex. There was a young woman who talked about meeting an ex-boyfriend, thinking that she was going to give him emotional support, him, having sex with her, even though she clearly said no and didn't want to have sex, she still described it in that way. Or there was a young man who in the book tells us this story about going out with a woman who was sort of into him. He wasn't into her, but she asked him out on a date, and there's a much longer story in the book, but basically describes having sex with her as she goes in and out of consciousness, and presents this story to us where he's sort of the aggrieved party because he didn't want to really be doing it, but he felt like he had to because he had a social obligation to her. And it was really surprising to hear the degree to which people talked about things where they knew what an assault was. If you ask them, what is a sexual assault? They would say, these are Columbia students, Ivy League students who've been through a lot of trainings, on this measure. And they would say, well, sexual assault is any non-consensual sexual touching or contact. And yet, when we talked to them about their experiences, we heard lots of stories about non-consensual sexual touching or contact that they just described as having sex. Now, this impoverishment, I think, of their understanding shouldn't be shocking to us, because not a lot of people talk to young people about sex other than talking to them about sex in ways that are grounded in shame and fear. And so this big surprise, in some ways, is like highly predictable, because when we talked to young people about their sex ed, they sort of joked. They were like, oh, you mean my sexual diseases course? And what they meant by that was that they were like basically told about all of the terrible things that would happen to them if they had sex. They were basically told about STIs, sexually transmitted infections, and unwanted pregnancies. Now, the unwanted pregnancy piece, first of all, just centers heterosexuality in sex ed in a way that completely left out the queer students. But nobody sort of talked to them about what sex was for and how it should be a valuable part of their life. And so I think for some of the things that were sort of surprising and disheartening, we could see the foundations of those things being built in, the many years before they ever arrived on campus, where discussions of sex and sexuality were grounded in fear and shame, which is sort of why Jennifer and I have written this book centering kind of empathy and hope as the way that we want communities to begin to think about these things.
And I would there's so many things so many challenges, we're really not even going to get into that, but also things that we found surprising, or that people might find surprising in thinking about campus sexual assault. And another one is acknowledging the community level mental health burden of campus sexual assault, because if 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men and nearly half of all queer students experience assault during their time in school, first of all, there's the experience of the survivors, but then in addition, there's the co-survivors, right? Everybody has a friend who's been assaulted, and none of these students are licensed mental health professionals. And so they want to be good friends. They are trying to get through their courses. One young woman told us a story about deciding that she was going to tell her friend that what she experienced was an assault. And then her friend told her a story that was so hair-raising. She's like, oh, well, her assault was way worse than mine, so I'm not going to take up any space in this relationship with my suffering. And so students are carrying so much in terms of trying to figure out like what the triage should look like, and what's the line between being a good friend and knowing that someone needs professional help. And so, there's so much attention now to campus mental health, and that is inextricable from sexual violence on campus.
That's right. To begin to wrap up, because I do want to throw to some audience questions. One of the things that I returned to in preparing for the conversation, just reading the book, was the conclusion, which opens with essentially saying that it's not merely knowledge of widespread suffering that translates to policy change. You can look at famine, poverty, different things that we know about. You also explain the way that over the course of our lifetime, something like school bullying has gone from being as predictable and common as a slide on a play set to this now subject of legislation. I think this book helps to tee up how we get there as it relates to this conversation. And so I'm curious what strategies you recommend for campus and community advocates to implement moving forward to combat campus sexual violence.
I just got to say, Adam, that you're like our favorite reader ever. Like, I love that you picked up on the social problems framing of the conclusion. So just a shout out to you for being a really, really thoughtful reader. Our roadmap for a more comprehensive approach to sexual violence prevention is scaffolded by those three main ideas. So prevention needs to uphold everyone's sexual citizenship and teach that other people have an equivalent right to sexual self-determination. It needs to provide spaces for people to clarify their sexual projects. And we need to reimagine the sexual geographies that people move through. And so to put a little bit of more specificity into what we mean, first of all, sexual citizenship. There's a family role and there's a school role. The school role really has to do with comprehensive sex education. One of the papers from the broader research project that you mentioned at the beginning, the SHIFT research project, analyzing the survey that we did with undergraduates, found that women who'd had comprehensive sex education that included practicing how to say no to sex they didn't want to have, which is not abstinence-only sex education, it's just sex education that includes a skills development component, were half as likely to be raped. So basically, sex ed is a sexual violence vaccine. And obviously, the goal is to teach people not to commit sexual violence, in addition to preparing people to defend their sexual boundaries. But we think sex ed could do that too. So there is a really very clear consensus in the research community that sex ed produces, that good sex ed is tied to a whole range of positive outcomes. And what we see is political cowardice. There is, on the part of parents, bipartisan support for schools to provide comprehensive sex ed. And at the state legislative level, our elected leaders have really failed to step up. So we must have better comprehensive sex ed. We must have comprehensive sex ed, period. I mean, we're living in a world in which last year, the big step forward in Illinois was to change the law so that sex ed was no longer required to be homophobic, which means now there are only 4 states in America that require that if sex ed is provided, it must be homophobic. So schools need to do much more. And we need to demand that schools do more in terms of providing gold standard comprehensive sex ed. But families also play a really important role in acknowledging and fostering young people's understanding of sexual citizenship and their understanding of other people's equal sexual citizenship. I mean, when you have a child, like, one of the things that you teach them is not to stomp on other people's feet, right? To like be respectful of other people's body space, and not to grab, not to hit, not to be a biter. And so it's that same understanding about other people's right to physical self-determination that parents need to just go a little bit further in having those conversations, but they can't have those conversations if they never even use the word penis and vulva, right? And so I think parents produce so much sexual shame, which is an erasure of young people's sexual citizenship. If you convey to your children as very young children that genitals are shameful, you're not teeing them up well to think about having a right to sexual self-determination. And there are lots of positive things that parents can do by making sure that their children have access to gender affirming sexual and reproductive health care, as well as overall health care. You're saying, you know, I see you. Maybe you want to talk about these things with someone other than me. Parents can also, I know this is not where all parents are, but I think this is an important thing that parents can do. If they really want their children to be in a relationship where commitment and sex and emotional care are all together, where they're not just having sex with a random stranger out there, they could let their children do it at home. What that means is supporting the sleepover. When your kid is at an age where they're having sex, if you want them to do it in a way that is safe and loving, you could let them do it under your roof, as opposed to doing what so many American parents do, which is to say, not under my roof. So that's the sexual citizenship part. If you think about driving, like our approach to driving is not to let the young people just grab the keys when they're drunk and hope that it works out okay, right? Like we have a whole structure of graduated driving laws, and consequently, the combination of those driving laws and limiting young people's access to alcohol, young people's traffic fatalities have dropped really significantly over the past few days. Now, that didn't happen over the past few decades. That didn't happen from parents saying to their kids, don't crash, right? Like instead we created a whole structure. And so we could create a similar structure. We could acknowledge that young people will have sex as part of their emergence into adulthood. Not all of them, but many of them. In the same way that we acknowledge that young people, many of them will want to learn how to drive. And we could create structures that help them do that safely. The sexual projects, I think that has to be integrated in the family space and in the sex ed space, just a room for young people. You can't clarify your sexual projects if you don't feel like you have a right to have sex at all, right? So the sexual citizenship is the sort of fundamental part. But then once you're trying to support sexual citizenship, room to think about what you want sex to be for. And Shamus and I are agnostic about what the right sexual project is for young people. But we're judgy actually about the sexual citizenship. Sexual citizenship is a moral project of recognizing other people as equivalent human beings. And then the sexual geographies part we've talked about a little bit. I think the only thing that I just wanted to draw a broader connection to is we see sexual violence in every single institution in which we see human beings, right? So in families, in religious institutions, in schools, in the military, on the subway, in organized sports. These problems are not separate, right? We live in a world where we're not teaching people to have sex without hurting other people. And so, sure, some of that sexual violence is intentionally committed harm. And that's a whole other thing. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who hurt other people because nobody taught them to do better. And so in all of those institutions, that's where there's room for us to pull, as Shamus said, all these levers that are not being pulled.
Thank you. Well, here comes my favorite part, where I get to essentially just be the voice for what has risen to the surface for our MCSR community. So I have a few questions here that come from our college age network. Shout out to the Men of Strength Club and the Women Inspiring Strength and Empowerment Club and all of the good folks who support that work. So we could do rapid fire or take your time, but I'm going to start with one that this person really dug into sexual citizens because they noted what chapter they're referencing. This is from chapter 3. They say, when thinking about today's sexual landscape, it's important to note how social pressures affect sexual encounters. How do social risks impact young people's navigation in their own sexual projects?
It's such a great question. And yeah, I totally agree. Shout out to the person who did this. I mean, we we have, not just in chapter 3, but in another chapter a little later in the book, we talk about the power of the group and the way that group dynamics are so important for understanding sex. And so if you think for a moment just about how we talk to young people about preventing sexual assault, there's basically sort of 2 tools we give them with. The first is consent education and having them think through what consent looks like. And in, vast majority of cases, this is like a person-to-person interaction where you talk to the other person about your wants and desires, and you inquire from them about their wants and desires, and you get something back from them. And that sets, this is like a really good skill to have. Jennifer and I are totally pro-consent education. We think it's absolutely essential. But to return to Jennifer's driving metaphor, it's kind of like teaching people to drive by telling them that you need to know how to stop at stop signs and red lights. And we're like, yes, you need to know that. But like, you know what else you need to know? What side of the road to drive on. Like, you need to know the speed limit. You need to know that when you see a yield sign, it means the other person gets to go first. There's so much more to sex as an encounter than just this consent education. The other piece that we give them is bystander intervention, which is sort of to say, if you see something, do something about it. Bystander intervention, also, we're super happy about. But many of the assaults that we heard about were like contexts where people were actually pretty happy about what was happening until they weren't. Like in the story that Jennifer told about Charisma, she was perfectly fine making out with that guy. If somebody had seen them flirting at a bar, she would have been very happy to go home with him. And then things weren't great. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we need to think more broadly. And one of the things that we need to think about is some of the group level dynamics that produce sex or sexual assault opportunity structures. So like, we have got a language for this, right? There's the idea of the matchmaker or the wingman, right? There are ways that we see each other. There's like the language of the cock blocker, right? There's all of this language that we have that sort of implicitly notes how it is that groups are an integral part of people's sexual opportunities and setting up sex for people. But then when it comes to sexual violence, we often then sort of ignore those parts of it when it comes to prevention processes. So like, to get super practical, like, what does this mean? What should we be doing? Well, I hate to kind of like fall back on this all the time, but I'll fall back on 2 things. One, the student's question sort of points to a range of things that are sort of peer pressure producing. And one of them, I think that's deeply tied to sexual assault. About half assaults, maybe a little bit more, involve substance use. And one of the things where we see a lot of peer pressure actually is in something like substance use. And I think that we can take the analytic framework that Jennifer and I use to think a little bit critically about why there's so much substance use on campus. And here I'm going to center masculinity and whiteness, because we know that men drink way more than women drink in college and in general. We also know that among ethnic groups, whites drink more than most other ethnic groups. They drink more than Asians, they drink more than Black Americans. This is on a national level. And again, it doesn't like make these people bad, like they're drinking more. Maybe we should have some interventions on that, but maybe we shouldn't. Let's just let them do what they want to do. But if we give them the spaces where socialization happens, what are we doing? We're centering drinking as part of the culture of like partying on campus, because with masculinity and whiteness, that happens. The other thing I sort of would think about is like how it is then that inequities are built into groups and create a lot of pressures within groups to do things that people may not want to do, but they do it for the dynamics of the groups. And again, it's sort of like using our own lens of power inequality, and inequality helps us see some of this and then think about like, what would it look like to make it sort of easier for people to have more opportunities for interactions within their college life, where they could actually sort of like move beyond groups that maybe they find unhealthy. One of the things that we heard from a lot of students was like, groups were so important for jobs, internships, friendships, etc. And like, once you built them, like it was hard to build new ones. And the risk of exiting them was really high for those kinds of opportunities. And so that meant that people stayed in situations that were unhealthy for lots of reasons, not just sexual assault. And so that provides like moments for administrators, like campus communities, organizations more generally to think about like what would it look like to lower the bar of entry so that like you didn't have to be a member of a club to participate in something new or meet some new set of people.
Got it. Thank you for that. Well, here at MCSR, the National Healthy Masculinity Community Conversations, we got to talk a little bit about engaging men and boys. What I will say is that I felt the book did a really good job of equitably not only centering women, but also men and queer survivors and how that is a part of the sexual assault conversation. So this question reads, what, if any, what is the importance of rewriting the discourse experienced in heterosexual couples that places gendered responsibility on men and boys to initiate consent conversations? How, if at all, does a gendered lack of agency lay a foundation for sexual assault?
Yes, that is a really important question. In so many of the interviews, cis hetero students expressed that it was men's job to sort of move the ball down the field, that if sex was going to happen, it was men's job to make it happen, and that it was therefore also men's job to secure consent. We remember, like, so compelling, one young woman in the interview, we asked her how she got consent from her male partner, and she looked up and she was like, well, I think guys get consent from you, don't they? And so that narrative of gendered sexual scripts, as social scientists would call them, where that narrative laying the responsibility for both sex and consent on men. So it's like as if we're in a Jane Austen novel where like women's only thing that they can do is say no or yes, makes men's experiences of being assaulted unintelligible both to men and to women. So women are sort of read an erection as a barometer of desire. Like if a man is physically excited, he must want to have sex. Think back to the story that Shamus shared of that young man who was assaulted by a woman when he was drunk. She may have never occurred to her that he didn't want, that a man wouldn't always want to have sex. And so we have to disrupt that basic assumption that men always want to have sex, so that both so that women ask men for consent and don't assault them, and also so that we can see that it's a very impoverished way to think about sex, is to think that it's men's responsibility to do consent and it's women's responsibility to establish a sexual boundary. So yes, I think that disrupting that, it renders the men's assaults visible, and it renders the project of having sex something other than this like transaction around consent. It acknowledges the complexity of what people are doing, as opposed to having it just be like a stop sign that you're going to get through or not.
Thank you. Similarly, question here. What, from your perspective, is needed for young men to feel quote unquote deserving of receiving verbal consent, since it is often unusual for them to view their own sexual autonomy in sexual encounters?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this goes way back to sort of one of Jennifer's early responses in thinking about centering sexual citizenship as a core part of what it is that we educate young people in, which is to say that sexual citizenship is the idea that people have the right to say yes to sex and the right to say no to sex, and an obligation to see that in other people. I mean, in some ways, like the assumption of the constant sort of sexual desire of men erases the first part of it, the right to say yes to sex, because it's assumed that the yes is already there and always there. And so, I think Jennifer and I are trying to use this framework to get us to think through what it would mean to have conversations with young men, young women, young people about their own desires and how those desires are things that they need to respect in and of themselves, and that they need to respect in other people. And you can't have that conversation with men with women, with anyone, if it just starts from the presumption that sex is a problem, or it starts from a presumption that sex is natural, because sort of the idea of the naturalness of sex can often like erase queer people. It can suggest that like it's just instinct, right? It's not actually about what it is that you desire. And I think this is also where our concepts get coupled, because for so many young people, no one has the conversation about what sex is for. That is, about what their sexual projects are. Now, I think if the people listening along, or if any of us here just think about our own lives, in my context and in so many of the young people's context that we were in conversation with, like they'd had lots of conversation about what college was for. They'd had lots of conversation about what selecting a major was for. So many young people had older people in their lives sit them down as part of basic mentoring and say to them, college is going to be really important. Picking the right major is going to be really important. Getting a job is going to be really important. Make sure to focus on that. Be clear about what you want. Be intentional in how it is that you're structuring your life. No one that we spoke to had an adult sit down and say to them, sex is going to be a really important part of your life. It's going to be one of the ways that you connect to people who are the most important to you. You should think about who you want to be in that part of your life, and who you want to be with, and how you want to sort of hold yourself as you do those things. Those conversations were sort of completely absent. And I think this is not then the failure of masculinity in men. It's a failure broadly of our gendered and racialized and classed and sexualized institutions that have sort of like just left it all to this idea of nature or to scripts without actually bringing these explicit conversations forward.
All right, last one. And I don't play favorites. I'm really grateful to everyone who submitted, but I think this one's, I reacted to this question, because I think it's an honest, vulnerable share about a question that young people have been asking themselves for generations and will ask for a while. But also you all, I know you speak directly to it in the conclusion, so I'm excited to give you a chance to address it. It says, are there ways verbal and nonverbal cues of consent can work in tandem to create a landscape that works within young people's standards of social acceptance? I.e., if verbal consent, like do you want to have sex, is considered quote unquote uncool, what is the best way to reach a nonverbal cue? And are nonverbal cues or clues to be encouraged and taught?
Yes, they are to be encouraged and taught. That's, I think, that goes back to the stoplight thing, right? Like it's not, consent is not a moment, it's a process. And ideally, again, we're not judgy about sexual projects, but if you want to not be terrible at sex, you actually need to be paying attention to your partner the whole time, right? Not just like in one moment to see if they want to get out of there. And so we encourage people to not be terrible at sex, to think about the people they're having sex with not as a scratching post to get off. And so, yeah, I think they're like paying attention the whole time. I think, one of the things that we do in Sexual Citizens is talk about sex that is hurtful or unkind, but not illegal. And just put it out there as something for people to think about. Like, it's a pretty low standard that we should be having sex that doesn't break the law. Like, how about we strive to have sex in ways that recognize the common humanity of the person we're having sex with, whether it's for like an hour or a lifetime. So yes, of course, like verbal cues, if it feels like it's not you to say, do you want to have sex? Then don't say, do you want to have sex? But like, pay attention to the other person. And also, do you want to have sex is a pretty vague question, right? Like, what is sex anyway? And so it's not like there needs to be either there needs to be much more verbal conversation, or there needs to be a lot of attention to body language. It's not just a moment of consent. It's a process of putting your body with someone else's body in a way that is like at minimum, not hurtful and not illegal, but also like you could strive for something better than that. Shamus, you have something to add on?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of an analogy of like, if you ask someone, hey, do you want to go to a movie? And they say yes. And you're like, great, we're going to go to the movie that I want to go to. And we're going to eat the popcorn with butter in the way that I want. And we're going to get the drink that I want. Like, that's a pretty shitty experience for the other person who goes to the movie with you, right? Like, it also means like, what movie would you like to see? And where do you want to sit? And like, can we talk about the snacks? And like, if the person is like, as you're like, I'll have 2 tickets to like RoboCop 2, the person kind of winces and is like, oh, this isn't ideally the movie I want to be at. Like, that's a moment where you would be like, oh, did you want to see something different? And so I think like, these are like, you know, these are things that we do all the time. And, you know, just building off what Jennifer said, like, if we think about consent as an event rather than a unfolding process of interaction with other people, then we really miss that. And I think like, you know, the standard of affirmative consent isn't just verbal. It can, as the question suggested, mean all kinds of other positive and negative affirmations, from facial responses to utterances that aren't words to, you know, reinforcing what somebody is doing, that really convey a wide range of things. And like, as Jennifer said, being constantly attentive to that is really important.
Thank you both for that. And thank you both for this entire conversation. We really appreciate your time today, the time that you've put into the book, and allowing us to spend this time to discuss it and keep moving the conversation forward. That'll do it for this episode of the National Healthy Masculinity Community Conversation Series. If you enjoyed this video, you are more than welcome to throw us a like or to subscribe to see more content from MCSR. You can visit mcsr.org/sign up. To learn more about events, products, programs, and services that we offer, you can visit sexualcitizens.com to learn more about the book, including where to find it, and also the space toolkit that was mentioned as a resource. And we'll see you back here next time. Jennifer and Shamus, thank you. And thank you all for tuning in. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.